How has the Enlightenment rationalism influenced modern culture? Does the profit motive behind capitalism lead to a proliferation of freedom and individuality? These are some of the main questions we'll be concerned with in this lecture video, focused on the culture industry, a later chapter in the book The Dialectic of Enlightenment by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. These were two influential thinkers in what is known as critical theory, and specifically they're from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, a approach to philosophy, to social theory and sociology that focuses on social change, that focuses on undermining power. It comes from a Marxist tradition, so they're influenced by Marx, they're influenced by Hegel and dialectics, but they are also interested in, perhaps unlike the more traditional Marxism, which is focused on material circumstances primarily, critical theorists like Horkheimer and Adorno are focused on culture. They're focused on ideology, kind of the superstructure aspects of the dialectic between the superstructure and the base. So, we'll look at the main features of the culture industry here. We think, at least I think that we live in a rational society. A society that is a child of the Enlightenment. A society that is immersed in capitalism, in rational modes of production. But what does such a rational society produce? What are its consequences? What might be the kind of underside of rationality? The culture industry is a concept about the standardization and false singularity of cultural items and persons. So this concept is developed by Horkheimer and Adorno in order to explain how in mass culture and mass society, industry produces standardized persons. And it does so because corporations produce standardized products which fit our needs and our demands. Now, it might make sense. You would say, well, of course, you have people that have certain desires that need to be met. A business tries to create a product that meets those desires, so it fulfills them. Maybe even businesses might try to create through advertisement or other things new desires. But regardless, there's kind of a relation between the independent consumer and the business which produces the products. Now, we've all heard of the term consumerism, right? And so we might think of consumerism as being maybe an ugly aspect of that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that when someone consumes a product, they're engaged in some kind of maybe nihilistic activity, if we want to think of it that way. But what's interesting about the theory of the concept of the culture industry by Horkheimer and Adorno is that it's actually a system of domination. That consumers think they're free to pursue the various diverse options that are produced by capitalist production. And yet it's actually corporations that are producing our needs and desires, kind of putting us into a false sense of freedom. Now, some of the major themes that we're going to look at of the culture industry have to do with passive consumerism, style over content, pseudo-individuality, and pervasive ideology. Now, with passive consumerism, I think it's often the case that we know, living in the 21st century, oftentimes you might have a TV on in the background. If you don't know what to do, you turn on the TV. Maybe you listen to a podcast, get on a social media app, Twitter, TikTok, maybe YouTube. Maybe you go buy some things to fulfill your desires, or a kind of a hole of uncertainty that you're feeling. All these kinds of things, whether it be in films, radio, magazines, they are used to manipulate mass society into passivity. And what it means is it's not that the consumer, the individual, is actually choosing or through their choices that they make in the marketplace. It's not that they're actually leading businesses to produce things that they really want. But actually, there's a kind of passive consumption, a passive culture of consumption, or a culture of passive consumption that's created by the culture industry, because there's nothing left for the consumer to actually classify, to intellectually identify uniquely, since the producers have actually done it for them. Now, we see this in the case of advertising. Advertising attracts the consumer to buy a product by stimulating that desire. Most of the time, advertisements do not work by actually addressing a desire that someone has when you're, of course, trying to sell a new product. That desire that the advertising is trying to identify, to tell you about, to advertise, doesn't actually exist within reality. It's not something necessarily natural. It's artificially created, such that the advertisement then, selling the kind of fulfillment to the desire that you didn't know you have, buying that product, it sells you this idea that by consuming the product, you satiate the desire. But what actually happens is you can never truly satiate the desire. And so you never truly satiate the needs of the consumer, leading to the consumer needing to come back and buy your product again, or search for other products that might satiate that desire. So Horkheimer and Adorno write, the culture industry endlessly cheats its consumers out of what it endlessly promises. The promissory note of pleasure issued by plot and packaging is indefinitely prolonged. The promise, which actually comprises the entire show, disdainfully intimates that there is nothing more to come, that the diner must be satisfied with reading the menu. That is the secret of aesthetic sublimation, to present fulfillment in its brokenness. The culture industry does not sublimate, it suppresses. So the culture industry does not actually take your desire up to a higher level of rational appreciation. What it actually does is, through this rationally coordinated advertisement campaign, it actually suppresses higher kinds of desire, leading you to actually kind of consume lower, more base desires, because it's the lower base desires that are not unique. It's the lower base desires that are repetitive. It's the lower base desires that are easily consumable, easily packageable. And it's those which can be turned into a mass product. In the culture industry, there is an emphasis of style over content. When you purchase that commodity, it's not actually about the content of the thing itself. What makes the commodity something desirable in a mass society are certain characteristics. That it is identical, it is artificial, it's inartistic, rubbish, standardized, mass-produced, no real variety, formulaic, predictable, interchangeable, and repetitive. Why? We think that when I'm having here Coke, it's going to be different from all the other kinds of sodas. But to what extent is, Coke or Coke Zero Sugar, Diet Coke, what extent is it different from Pepsi, Pepsi Zero, Diet Pepsi, RC Cola, so on and so forth, right? I see it as a reflection of my own difference from someone else who prefers Pepsi. Is that actually a false difference? What the culture industry does to enable this kind of passive consumption, such that maybe I don't even realize the kinds of desires that have been created by the culture industry, is that the products it sells are simple and standardized because they're easy to produce, and therefore easy to consume, and then regurgitate. Now, interestingly, the key characteristic then of all these various characteristics is monopoly. Now, you might ask, yeah, but in capitalism, what results is competition. And we can see, I just mentioned RC Cola, Pepsi, Coke, etc. It seems like we have competition that's going on with all these different products that would lead to, producing unique individual kinds of commodities that then are going to appeal to unique individual people such that we can see creativity in the marketplace. But what Horkheimer and Adorno argue is that this kind of competition is false. First, it's false because profit motive incentivizes corporations to conform. When one business model does something unique, such that then it might actually attract consumers, well, all the businesses want to immediately, as soon as possible, replicate what that business does. And secondly, consumers actually have a false power because they're given options that we think are real options in the marketplace of diverse choices to consume, to purchase. They're actually the given options reflected by the interests of the capitalist class. We'll see in a moment how exactly that's the case. But Horkheimer and Adorno say, what is new, however, in modern capitalism is that the irreconcilable elements of culture, art, and amusement have been subjected equally to the concept of purpose and thus brought under a single false denominator, the totality of the culture industry. Its element is repetition. The fact that its characteristic innovations are in all cases mere improvements to mass production is not extraneous to the system. With good reason, the interest of countless consumers is focused on the technology, not on the rigidly repeated, threadbare, and half-abandoned content. The social power revered by the spectators manifests itself more effectively and a technically enforced ubiquity of stereotypes than in the stale ideologies which the ephemeral contents have to endorse. Think about most of the innovations that occur. They're actually not innovations in content. It's innovations in the technology that produces the content. It's innovations that make it such that you can produce a commodity cheaper or quicker or more of them, right? It's not so much actually about the thing being created itself. Okay, so in thinking about style over content, I want to begin with music. Famously, this is something that Adorno is a theorist of, and he writes quite vividly, I think, in this chapter, The Culture Industry. What you'll notice, I think, with music, especially pop music, is the tendency for repetition in terms of typically a song is going to be, around 2 minutes, 2.5, 3 minutes. It varies a little bit, but there's a kind of consistency around that because it's good for the radio. It's good to use for any kind of segments, maybe, commercials or things like that. And typically the songs, the reason why as well, they can be kind of uniformly created around that kind of time range is they're usually set up the same way. Maybe an introduction, you have the first section or the chorus maybe, then a bridge, maybe the second section or a chorus. Maybe you have some kind of instrumental, then back to the chorus, and then you have the ending. It's kind of a pretty standard setup that you find kind of repetitively in music. You also find that with music, if you look at time signatures, most of the music that makes the most money, that is used the most, that's sold the most by record industries, is going to be in 4/4 time. 4/4 time is easy. It's standardized. It's repetitive. It's something easy for someone to just kind of have in the background when it's in 4/4, where they can kind of monotonously just listen to it, maybe to drown out other kinds of anxieties or whatever else, as opposed to music that's in odd time signatures that is kind of an intellectual, more of an intellectual enterprise, more maybe creative, something that's pushing the boundaries. And so you have this kind of almost evening out of music in the music industry to be the same, to be replaceable. You have one pop star, they get a little older, so you get a new pop star that you're going to think is going to be the new one of a similar mold, maybe a slightly different flavor, but more or less a similar mold. And you see the way then that kind of music is used through, sports, through commercials, the way that kind of music can be easily commodified. Now, we also have, looking at art, The movie industry. Think about how many superhero movies there are, how many remakes of the superhero movies, right? You have a whole series, maybe 3 or 4, a Batman series comes out. 8, 10 years later, oh, we're going to make the new series again. It's of the same stuff, but new actors, maybe slightly different narrative. More or less, it's relatively the same. Or you just expand the universe. So you have, however many of the Avengers kinds of off spins, or think about TV shows. So you have TV shows that are popular. You try to run it for as long as possible, but it comes to an end. So what do you do to continue making money? You just have a spin-off from the TV show. So it's roughly the same, but it gets people interested. It's kind of like an addiction that they can still continue to watch the same kind of material, where it doesn't require much artistic innovation because it's just an off spin of the same old show. And again, this isn't to deny that there can be good music or there can be good movies that are off spins or remakes, etc. That's not really the point. The point is about the kind of sameness and the standardization such that it's made to be repetitive, to be regurgitatable. And I think you also find this with, not just looking at movies, but think about the kind of streaming services. Is there really that much of a difference between Amazon Prime, Netflix, Hulu, Apple TV? Maybe when they start out, the kind of things they might cater to, the kind of access they have might be different. Over time, what's really the difference between one or the other? You're just paying money to these ostensibly, competitive, different, unique streaming platforms. They just kind of trade, off of the rights to certain movies, and it ends, another one picks up the rights. So you're just paying multiple services for ultimately one kind of thing that's just doubled or tripled or quadrupled. Think about architecture. Now, in architecture, there is artistry, but mass architecture is what we're concerned with. Now, of course, mass architecture is good, right? You want there to be a mass production of homes such that people can live in them, to provide for the need for shelter, the need to have a family, to have a stable place to live. But I think what you'll notice is there will be trends, because there's either firms that are going to want to copy what other firms are doing because they think, well, this is what's in demand right now. Or you actually just have one giant corporation that actually owns all the different apartment complexes that are being built. And so you'll notice, right, apartment complexes used to be kind of the same. They were all usually bland colors, so colorless, white, maybe gray, something like that. Eventually, one kind of company starts making these with a bit of color. So here we have like brown and a bit of yellow and white, and so it's pleasing to the eye. But then what do you notice? Well, it's like a cookie cutter. All of a sudden, the other ones start doing similar things. We have the balcony that's kind of more square, metallic like that, where they have the different colors contrasting off one another. And it's just kind of like copy and paste, or maybe you change up the color scheme. But by and large, right, the new kind of unique apartment buildings that were unique for a couple of years, they start popping up everywhere, all the same. Or think about iPhones, right? Or just any kind of phone or whatever in general. A new iPhone comes out, what, every year? Is there really that much difference between the previous one and the new one? Maybe there's some slightly, cosmetic differences. Maybe there will be a new upgrade for, some bug or something in the system. But by and large, all these new iPhones are relatively the same year after year. Now, maybe there's a big difference, of course, between 2007 and 2017. But Apple and these other companies, right, they want you to buy this every year. The new thing, the new latest thing that's going to be unique, that's going to make you different from others, until, of course, everyone else also has that product. Or think about the grocery store. You go to the grocery store, there's diversity, there's choice among the products that you can purchase, right? Think about the cereal aisle. But is there really all that much of a difference between all the different kinds of cereals and the kinds of diverse choices that are offered? Yes, I mean, there are lots of different choices offered. Um, if you want to look at, perhaps uh, the minute details. But by and large, are they really all that different? Are the different brands all that different? Well, we can look at the companies that actually own these brands, and it turns out there's false competition. Many of them are actually owned by parent companies, and that parent company is probably owned by another parent company, or would that be a grandparent company? Such that there's actually false competition. Where when you see, think of Kellogg's, right? You see, oh, well, there's cornflakes, and then there's Fruit Loops, and then Frosted Flakes, and Mini Wheats, and Raisin Bran. It's actually all owned by the same company ultimately. So we can see in these kinds of products in our daily life how the kind of commodities that are sold to us as trying to please our desires or make us different, they're actually all kind of a repetitive nature because that's how profit works. You want something that can be mass produced. You want something that looks unique, looks cool, such that it makes you think you have this special desire, or it's going to actually satiate a desire you didn't even know you had. But it's all just part of the process of slowly, unconsciously getting you to participate in the culture industry, making you one and the same as everyone else. But aren't mass commodities sold because individuals freely desire them in the first place? Why isn't it the case that we can say, okay, yes, businesses produce these kinds of repetitive commodities that really aren't that different, but they produce these things because individuals, through their own free will, choose them in the first place. And you have different products ultimately because it is able to meet the differences of the various consumers. What Horkheimer and Adorno argues that the individual, like a product, is actually mass produced. That this difference between the product, the commodity, and the individual, the consumer, is a false difference. Both are actually reified. They say, the culture industry has sardonically realized man's species being. Everyone amounts only to those qualities by which he or she can replace everyone else. All are fungible, mere specimens. As individuals, they are absolutely replaceable, pure nothingness, and are made aware of this as soon as time deprives them of their sameness. So, Marx speaks of species being as that kind of potential of a human being to realize their full rational capacities, to have full control over all the circumstances of their existence. What Horkheimer and Adorno are saying is that the culture industry ends up molding the individuals into sameness, because of course you want the same kinds of individuals so you can make mass products. But secondly, it actually convinces the individuals that they are different, when in reality, they are the same. So the difference in mass society is a false difference. It promotes pseudo-individuality. I think one part of where we can see this pseudo-individuality is that in the culture industry, in mass society, we find that if we talk about, a public individual versus a private individual, or private life, public life, or if we think about the obligations of a citizen compared to a consumer, we find that in mass society, the culture industry promotes consumer identity above all else, such that we think that when we are actually being our most, perhaps, patriotic or our most rebellious, it's actually through consumer activities. Right? I think that I want to stick it to some party in power. What do? Well, I go and boycott some business that ostensibly is a supporter of them, or I go and buy products from something else. Right? I see who I really am as a consumer first and foremost, even if this is unconscious. Now, what about, though, a refusal to subscribe to mass culture? Can't we just either resist or step out, right? Just not participate in mass culture. Horkheimer and Adorno think no. They say anyone who resists can survive only by being incorporated. Once registered as diverging from the culture industry, they belong to it as the land reformer does to capitalism. Realistic indignation is the trademark of those with a new idea to sell. So think about the episode 10,000 Merits from the first season of Black Mirror on Netflix. That episode is about this individual who tries to resist a system, a totalitarian system. And what ends up happening is their resistance, their dissent against the system, is actually then just repackaged as another commodity to induce others to behave and follow the system. So when the individual threatens to kill themselves, well, they decide, hey, let's turn this into some kind of a broadcast that people can tune into, right? And get the feeling of the rush of this person going to kill themselves and real dissent. But of course, it's not real dissent. When one tries to resist, they're just reappropriated. A new product, perhaps, is going to be sold to them. A new lifestyle that's unique becomes something mass-produced. And if you really want to leave mass culture, well, death is the alternative. Because there is no existence in mass society and mass culture without subscribing, without being produced by the culture industry. So we can see how ideology then is all-pervasive in mass society. We see this first in that all value is reduced to exchange value, meaning what it's worth in monetary terms, what it's worth in the marketplace. Think about how oftentimes when we talk about education, what is the value of education? Well, it's what job you can get from what degree you have or what you've learned. We never talk about the value of education for the sake of education, for perhaps the sake of enlightening oneself, of realizing one's species being their true potential. Horkheimer and Adorno say everything has value only insofar as it can be exchanged, not insofar as it is something in itself. For consumers, the use value of art, its essence, so the value one has in how they use it, not necessarily what it can be sold for in the market, but how it's used by an individual for their own unique way, is a fetish. So in the culture industry, something that is seen as having use value as opposed to exchange value is seen as a fetish, something a bit weird and odd. So what happens? Well, the fetish, the social valuation, they say, which they mistake for the merit of works of art, becomes its only use value, the only quality they enjoy. Secondly, productive participation in the culture industry occurs even when one is not actively producing. They say entertainment is the prolongation of work under late capitalism. It is sought by those who want to escape the mechanized labor process so that they can cope with it again. The only escape from the work process in factory and office is through adaptation to it in leisure time. This is the incurable sickness of all entertainment. One is at work, one labors, and one's freed. So by laboring, they are producing for the culture industry. And then in their off time, they're still engaging with the culture industry through entertainment that is sold as giving them downtime, release from the tension of work. But in all aspects of one's life, one is engaging in the culture industry. One is ultimately aiding in the exponential growth of profit. Finally, those most dominated by the culture industry insist unwaveringly on the ideology by which they are enslaved. And we see this, Horkheimer and Adorno say, in the perpetuation of the myth of success, where those that are most dominated, those that work the hardest in laborious jobs, perhaps 2 or 3 jobs, they do so because they believe in the myth of success, that they too, through hard work, can make it. And yet, The vast majority of wealth created goes to a minority of people. If you look at statistically the amount of wealth that is created, you can see a split, an inequality, such that those that have end up having more and more. And while yes, some can improve relatively their position in society through hard work and labor, it's very, very rare that someone actually makes it. Right? That they become the billionaire or the millionaire that is pitched as, well, if you work hard, you can become one like me. And if you look at this just conceptually, it's actually impossible. It is a myth, because what it's argued is if you work hard, you too can make it. You can rise above the culture industry, become a true master of your circumstances. But what's required is actually that, one, if you own capital, so if you're a business person, you rely on more people than yourself to work and produce value, to produce products. You can only actually create profit if then you have more people than yourself that are laboring to produce value, to produce commodities to be sold. What that means then is necessarily for there to be profit, a majority of people cannot actually be capitalists. A majority of people cannot actually attain that kind of success that the capitalist says, if you just work hard, you can attain this as well. So it is indeed a myth because it relies on a minority of people controlling the means of production. Ultimately, this thesis of the culture industry comes from their larger thesis from the book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, a critique of rationality, of Enlightenment itself, asking, well, why is it the case that if we have this growth in the Enlightenment, we are children of the Enlightenment, why did we lead in the 1930s to fascism? Why did we lead to mass conflict in the 20th century? And what they argue is actually because Enlightenment has an opposite that is always necessarily with it. And the emphasis on rationality, they say, that is a product of the Enlightenment, is characterized by a fear of the unknown, resulting in a drive to dominate nature and a drive of humans to dominate other humans. So if Enlightenment is a fear of the unknown, such that we want to have an explanation for everything, then we want everything to be calculable, to be regular. In so doing, the same thing has to be true of human beings. We need regular behavior such that we have no more inconsistencies. We have no more exceptions to the rule, so to speak. So they say technical rationality today is the rationality of domination. It's a bit similar to what Heidegger argues in the question concerning technology about the ways in which technical knowledge today is a kind. It says the only thing that is knowledge is that which is calculable or quantitative. But what Horkheimer and Adorno are arguing here is a bit different from Heidegger's phenomenology and epistemology of art as a kind of means of knowledge, and his critique of modern emphasis on quantitative knowledge. Because Heidegger's claim is a bit more, shall we say, transhistorical. It's a bit more focused on knowledge separate from the means of production in a social, economic, and political sense. Whereas Horkheimer and Adorno, they want to say, what's going on here with this emphasis on rationality is a result of, ultimately, capitalist exploitation. That they say, for them, the state of affairs of humans dominating other humans is epitomized in the capitalist system, where profit extracted through structures of domination and exploitation becomes the means by which wealth is accumulated. Heidegger doesn't go that far at all. He was not Marxist or socialist or communist. He was not opposed to capitalism for those kinds of reasons, for political reasons. So we can see here then what Adorno and Horkheimer have tried to do is show how there's this whole kind of production of ideology that's created by the culture industry that actually sells human beings this idea that they're really being free and rational when they're actually being controlled and dominated. All their desires, all their choices in the marketplace are actually not their own, that there's this pseudo-individuality. And this is the result of a peculiar emphasis on rationality in the structure of profit in the capitalist system. Now, I think there are still questions to consider and to think about. Like, what about niche products? Aren't there some products that really are unique? And we could also wonder, well, do we agree that technical rationality necessarily leads to domination? Finally, if dissent is appropriated by the culture industry, and the point of critical theory is to figure out how to have social change to overcome structures of domination, well, if dissent is going to be appropriated by the culture industry, then what purpose is there in resisting? Is there a roadmap that we can identify coming from the works of Adorno and Horkheimer that show us how then we can actually become more free? I think these are questions still worth considering.